How many of you have ever played a sport or watched a sporting event? Okay, now how many of those were co-ed or mixed gendered as opposed to just men's or just women's? You can probably count the answer on one hand. Why is this the case? Well, there are a number of reasons, but the key one is this. We make the assumption that men and women are so fundamentally physiologically different that they cannot and should not compete together. I'd like to suggest that assumption is wrong, and that we can reimagine sports to be more gender inclusive, not only so that men and women can compete together, but people of all genders too. Sports have always been a big part of my life, from soccer growing up to ultimate Frisbee now. This is a picture of me at a recent ultimate Frisbee tournament, while this is me from about 3 years ago. You can probably tell I look a little bit different now, and that's because I'm transgender. Now, a couple quick definitions before we go any further. Transgender, or trans, refers to a person whose gender identity, in my case, a woman, differs from the sex the person had or was assigned as having at birth, in my case, male. Cisgender, or cis, is the opposite of transgender and refers to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex the person had or was assigned as having at birth. This is the case for most people. Still, even with these definitions, when people hear the word transgender, they usually think of one of two things: drag queens, or the classic trans narrative of feeling like you're in the wrong body from a very young age. But neither of these is my story. I was about 12 when I first had clear feelings that I wanted to be a girl and that being a girl might be better for me, but I didn't tell anyone. I was honestly ashamed of my feelings because I and other boys were raised to believe that the worst thing a boy could be was a girl. So instead of dealing with my feelings, I repressed them for nearly a decade. It wasn't until about 3 years ago that I finally came to terms with my feelings and fully realized that I was and am transgender. While I was scared at first, I was even more relieved because I could now be who I wanted to be and live the life I had denied myself all those years. Still, I knew there would be challenges ahead as a transgender woman in the world. My transition on the whole, though, has been a good one. I've been very lucky and privileged to have supportive family and friends, especially within the ultimate Frisbee community. The last few years haven't been without their challenges, however, some of which have come because I've continued to play ultimate while transitioning. You see, as someone who was assigned male at birth and went through male puberty, people often assume that I have some inherent athletic and competitive advantages over non-trans or cisgender women. But this is simply not the case, because through hormone replacement therapy, in which I take 4 pills a day to make estrogen my primary sex hormone, I now have no significant athletic advantages over my cisgender counterparts. Hormones are that powerful, changing muscle mass, fat distribution, and other secondary sex characteristics. Still, if you don't want to take my word for it, take science's. A 2015 peer-reviewed study by medical physicist Joanna Harper demonstrated that transgender women have no clear athletic advantages after transitioning, maintaining the same relative athleticism before and after transition. Yet despite my experiences and Dr. Harper's study, our initial assumption still exists, and many sports organizations, including the NCAA and USA Ultimate, use it to justify restrictive policies. For example, USA Ultimate requires that transgender women, like me, suppress their testosterone levels for a year before being eligible to compete as the women we are. If that seems wrong, that's because it is. And I lost an entire year of college eligibility in Ultimate because of this policy. Now, although some of you are probably still holding on to that first assumption, my experiences have shown me that our differences aren't as clear as they seem, and that the line between men's and women's athleticism can be blurred by the effects of hormone therapy. So I'd like to suggest step 1 in reimagining gender inclusivity in sports. questioning, and then letting go of our assumptions. Now, I want to jump back to Ultimate because I think it offers a good starting point to step 2 in reimagining gender inclusivity in sports. Making sports more mixed gendered and more non-binary. When I talk about making sports more mixed gendered, I mean having men and women competing together and against each other at all levels of competition. Ultimate has a mixed gender division in addition to the usual men's and women's divisions. This is in contrast with most other major sports that only have men's and women's divisions, but Ultimate doesn't suffer for having mixed. In fact, the existence of a mixed division in Ultimate is a significant factor in its potential future Olympic Games inclusion. Now, I actually play in the mixed division with a team based right here in Reno called Cutthroat, after the Nevada state fish, the Lahontan cutthroat trout. Yes, we have a state fish in Nevada. Yes, this was news to me too. The mixed division in Ultimate is known for having tight-knit teams, and Cutthroat is no exception. They've been there for me through most of my transition, becoming a second family for me here in Reno. Now, although having a mixed gender division is clearly a step forward towards gender inclusivity, Ultimate still largely operates within the gender binary, assuming that all players are either men or women. But not all people identify as men or women, usually falling under the category of non-binary, so they get cut out of Ultimate and sports more broadly, with little ability to participate freely as who they are. So, how do we make sports more non-binary? Well, the sport of Quidditch, which is a real sport and not just in Harry Potter, has a rule they cleverly call Title 9 3/4. Right? Clever. Which states that a team can have a maximum of 4 players of the same gender on the field at the same time. No mentions of men only or women only, just any 4 people of the same gender. Any gender. Quidditch also has no limits on transgender athletes' participation, no one-year eligibility rules, or any specifications about the gender of their athletes. You can compete as you identify, no questions asked. So with Ultimate's mixed gender division and Quidditch's Title 9 3/4, we now have an outline of how to take step 2 in reimagining gender inclusivity in sports. Creating mixed gender divisions and not limiting participation to just men and women, but being open to people of all genders. But gender inclusivity in sports is not just a trans thing or a non-binary thing. It's an everyone thing, an everyday thing that affects not just me, but people around the country and around the world who don't fit into our societal boxes and expectations. Sports are an indispensable part of our society, bringing people together from all walks of life to play and cheer together. But they are too often restricted to those who fit into our gendered expectations for men and women. So non-binary and transgender athletes have our participation regulated, or we're kept out of competition altogether. Whether in schools where a young trans kid might not feel comfortable playing on a certain gendered team, or in everyday life where someone like me is looking for community as they start to transition. Being gender inclusive is necessary to ensure that everyone can fully participate in sports. This is why reimagining gender inclusivity in sports matters. This is why we need to have these conversations and rethink how we view and participate in sports. This won't be an overnight change, but something that we can do bit by bit, step by step. Step 1. We can start with our assumptions, our presumptions about the fundamental differences between men's and women's athleticism. Question them, and then let them go. Step 2. Next, how we can make and shape our sports to be more gender inclusive, more mixed gendered and more non-binary, more Ultimate-esque and more Quidditch-like. Finally, step 3. Doing the hard work of actually changing policy and procedures, but also the easy work of simply being accepting and inclusive of non-binary and transgender athletes like me. I really do believe that we can make progress towards gender inclusivity in sports, and that with just a little imagination, we can make real change so that sports are inclusive of all people, of all genders. Thank you.